Interview with the Dark Elf, written by Jamie Edmundson, performed by Chuck Wagner.
Interview with the Dark Elf. The recorder walked along the underground tunnel with trepidation. Darkness crowded him, made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up, made his guts wrench with anxiety. More than once he had almost turned back.
"What are you doing here?"
he berated himself. For the realm of the Dark Elves of Cleat Tenori Kilituan was not a place that non-Drow entered willingly. Even the Drow themselves thought twice about it. But the recorder had a problem. An irresistible compulsion to sift the facts from the fabrications, to peel back the layers of myth-making, the exaggeration and the misrepresentation, to record for posterity what really happened. That obsession had led him here. He began to pass the grey-skinned, white-haired citizens of this subterranean realm. They stared at him, no attempt to hide the malevolence from their expressions. Their eyes bored into his.
"Imagining ways to kill me," the recorder decided. "Pull my insides to the outside, feed me to their monsters. Or maybe they'd keep me alive with their devilish magic and ensure I suffered for eons."
Then he came to the aspen wood door, almost white in colour. It shone in the darkness with a kind of luminosity. The recorder raised a hand to knock. "You're not going in there, are you?" The recorder turned to see a dark elf staring at him with a horrified look. "Do you know who lives there?" the dark elf demanded. "I believe this is the abode of the nefarious Rokuberni Dihrath Simba, guilty of countless crimes during his time in Galazoo, dread servant of Lilith the succubus." "And why, in Gehenna, are you about to request entry?" "I am here to interview him," the recorder replied. "Part of the reason I am here," the recorder explained, "is to do with a series I am publishing concerning the life of the three-headed ogre, Og Grim Dog." Rokuberni Dihrath Simboa's mouth twisted in disgust at the mention of the ogre. The dark elf stood by the fireplace of his private room, in which hot coals smouldered. The recorder himself was seated at a writing desk, his quill, ink, and parchment set before him. There was an unmistakable power dynamic at play in the arrangement, the recorder looking much like a schoolboy receiving a lesson from his authoritarian but brilliant teacher. "I have read these books," said the dark elf, making the word books sound as welcome as dog feces. "There are copies in our library here." "Oh, they've made their way here, have they?" said the recorder, attempting nonchalance. But a professional's pride in their work is not easy to disguise. "Yes, they're in the shit books written by foreigners section." "Oh," said the recorder, crestfallen. "Think yourself lucky," said the dark elf, "that they're not in the books written by foreigners that are so terrible that the authors must be tracked down and mutilated section." "I do count myself lucky," the recorder hastened to say. "I'm most grateful." "One of the things that angered me about your second book was your insistence on calling me Simba. It was most offensive." The dark elf stared at the opposite wall of his room where two crossed swords hung on display. The recorder made a nervous gulping sound. "Well, that was because that's the name Ogrim Dog used when discussing you. Also, your full name is a little awe-inspiring." "Quite so." The dark elf looked slightly mollified with that response. "Since you've read the book, I was wondering if you'd be so kind as to fact-check something for me. It concerns the test of loyalty when the ogre became the Dark Lord's henchman. Rumours abound of the crimes he demanded of fresh recruits to prove their commitment to his cause, and yet when it came to Ogrim Dog, the Dark Lord simply accepted the killing of a solitary menial as payment, the dark elf finished for him.
One of the more ridiculous passages in the book.
Yes, well, I did challenge the ogre on that one, but they were quite insistent.
So, you want to know what Ogrim Dog really did to win the Dark Lord's approval? Asked the Dark Elf. The recorder nodded eagerly. Then, let me tell you. 5 minutes later, and Ro Kuberni de Ratsimboa was finishing up recounting the list of Ogrim Dog's crimes, which they proceeded to chop up and feed to his pet worm Evie. Anyway, after that, the Dark Lord accepted them as a henchman. The recorder had gone pale and clammy. He had a hand clasped over his mouth in an effort to keep the contents of his stomach from making an appearance.
I see,
he said weakly.
That would do it. Now I understand why they didn't want to tell me.
Quite, said the Dark Elf. I hope the truth will be making an appearance in your upcoming books.
Of course, said the recorder. The truth is my mistress.
The Dark Elf rolled his eyes. Anyway, I am sick of talking about that three-headed ogre. I can only presume that the real reason you are here is to record my own life story. Superior in every respect to that ogre's, I might add.
Yes, said the recorder. It would be a great honor to be given access to your story. I am sure it would make a wonderful novel.
Stop stating the obvious, the Dark Elf commanded. What payment might I expect from this enterprise?
Payment? Asked the recorder nervously. It's just that we writers make so very little money, he simpered.
Not in coin, came the dismissive response. Information. Tell me where you found the ogre.
Oh, I see, said the recorder nervously. Well, I'm sure that can't do any harm.
The Nefarious Exploits of Ro Kuberni de Ratsimboa, Dark Elf, Henchman, and Archvillain. An extract. Chapter 41. The ranks of menials marched ineptly through the gates of the Kuthenian city of Jizu. Lilith, Dark Lord of Fell Towers, had led her army here in support of her ally, Emperor Tiu. The truth was, however, that the mastermind behind the march south was none other than Ro Kuberni de Ratsimboa, most loyal and able of the Dark Lord's henchmen. The advantage of the menials was their numbers. There were thousands of them. This was offset by their incompetence. It took someone with the logistical brilliance of this aforementioned henchman to get them to their destination in one piece. Arriving in Jizu, however, turned out to be an anticlimax. The League armies are gone, the Imperial officer informed them once the henchman had helped his mistress from her mount. We drove them from our lands. He eyed the army of the Dark Lord. Without your help. The henchman admired his mistress's forbearance in allowing this insolent fool to live. Of course, the truth is always more complex than army grunts are cognizant of. The henchman's status meant that he was privy to the subsequent meeting of the most powerful leaders in all of Galizu. The Emperor, his generals and his advisers, but most important of all, Mistress Lilith and Master Samael. For all the pretense that Tiu was in charge here, the henchman knew better. The threat from the armies of the League has been replaced by a much greater one, Samael explained. An army of the undead now roams Kuthenia. It is so dangerous that we must divert all our resources into dealing with it. Kuthenian military and menials of Fell Towers alike. The henchman had nothing but disdain for the raised eyebrows of the Kuthenian nobility. They would soon learn what all Drow knew. Creatures that survived death were very much real. What of our enemies in the League? Pressed the Dark Lord, disappointed, as the henchman was, to learn that some other enemy had displaced them in Samael's thoughts. They may have retreated, but they are not yet defeated. Samael gestured at the Dark Elf. Send your henchmen to deal with them. Heads swiveled to stare at Ro Kuberni de Ratsimboa.
but his expression of cold disdain remained, even if he did feel some pride in the suggestion. Now these Kuthenians were beginning to understand his importance, how he, single-handedly, could be trusted to deal with an enemy their armies had spent months fighting. "Very well," agreed the Dark Lord. She turned to her most trusted henchman. "And why not lead some of these undead into the lands of our enemies while you're at it?" The Dark Elf nodded, a grisly smile on his face. Samael nodded, the same grisly smile appearing on his face. The Dark Lord nodded, and the henchman assumed the same grisly smile would be present beneath her helmet. Emperor Tune nodded as a grisly smile appeared on his face. One of the Emperor's officers put an arm up in the air and yelled,
"Oh, that will be sweet!"
"That's just going too far," said the Dark Lord. The Dark Elf had assumed that Merkazir would be where he would find the ogre and the rest of the Dark Lord's enemies, but while the Bureau of Dungeoneering was still operational, the ogre was gone, and it was Ogrimdog whom his master most wanted dead. It took effort and considerable skill to track the ogre's movements to Avolo. Ogrimdog was in the company of a human wizard and a wretched light elf, traveling south down the River Auster. The henchmen followed where they had gone, entering the great city at night and then mingling with its amorphous citizenry. If there was one place in Galazoo that one of his kind could move with relative freedom, it was in that great cosmopolitan city. Surely he would soon be able to complete his task, but the trail went cold. It was beyond strange that a three-headed ogre could just disappear, seemingly without a trace. It was the kind of situation where an individual without the fortitude of Rokuberni de Hratsimboa would give up. And then his quarry was back, as mysteriously as they had gone. The Dark Elf watched them in conversation with the Avoloese general, Caborna, and watched them as they left the city via the west gate. Just the three of them, alone in the countryside. He followed them, wary of getting too close. The light elf was suspicious, always on the lookout for danger. Who knew what magics the wizard could deploy? And the ogre, the henchman had learned, while ungainly in its movements, could finish an opponent with a single blow. He would have to pick his time to act with care. It didn't help that the undead were now abroad in these lands, drawn to his beating heart and his pumping blood as much as any other living thing. He was forced to take his rests out of reach, high up in strong trees, while beneath him the creatures scraped their fingers bloody on the trunk. Ever moaning with their insatiable hunger, never tired, it made proper sleep hard to come by. When he awoke, the henchman would draw his twin swords and send however many of the creatures that had gathered below him back to Gehenna. It was not until they reached the farm that the Dark Elf could grab an opportunity. Sent to sleep in some lowly human barn by the farmers, it left his quarry vulnerable. The henchman waited deep into the night. This time, when the undead came for him, he didn't send them to Gehenna. He captured them, tying them up until he had a dozen of the creatures roped together. Now to act. Leading his new recruits to the barn, he carefully removed several planks of wood, avoiding any sudden sounds that might alert those inside. Once the gap he had made was large enough, he released his captives, quickly moving away to a safe distance. The undead were drawn towards the nearest living creature. Rather than following the disappearing Dark Elf, they made their way inside the barn. Rokuberni de Hratsimboa allowed himself a satisfied smile as he waited, crouching behind a tree, for the undead to do their work. Their groans were shortly joined by startled shouts. Then a sudden blast of pale blue light. The wizard. Doubt crept its way into the dro's thoughts. The door of the barn burst open. Out came the ogre Ogrimdog. He was carrying the wizard, the elf running by his side. It all happened so fast that the henchman was left in his crouch, unsure what to do. Follow them, he told himself. For all his speed, he thought he'd lost them. Then he saw them up ahead. They'd stopped. The wizard had pulled his robe up, and they were talking amongst themselves. Not a total disaster, then, the henchman told himself. The wizard's been bitten. 1 down, 2 to go. The dark elf stalked the group. It was no good coming from behind with their anxious glances back to the barn and the undead. Instead, he circled around to the side, using the dark of night as cover, his twin swords sheathed for now, lest the cold iron reflect the moonlight and give him away. As he neared, he began to overhear their conversation. "Wasn't deliberate," he caught the wizard saying. "Please, come to the farm with us, if there's a chance," said one of the ogre's heads. "All right, Og," replied the wizard. The henchman mouthed the words of a foul, drow curse. Before he had reached them, his prey was on the move again, heading for the tall wooden enclosure of the farm. The only reason these humans had survived the undead apocalypse this long. He followed them, still keeping his distance. Not to worry, he told himself. These humans aren't about to sacrifice their family's safety by opening up their defenses to an ogre. The ogre was banging on the wooden wall. Just as the dark elf was calculating a surprise attack, he heard the moan of an undead from behind him. At the same time as he turned to face the threat, his twin swords were in his hands. Holding his left-hand blade in front of him, he swung his right blade in a huge arc. He had used plenty enough force for the sword to pierce through the skull and lodge in the brain of the creature. Another one returned to Gehenna, he told himself, as it collapsed to the ground and he yanked his weapon free. A burst of light, then, sent him scurrying away. That damned wizard again! He looked over. No! The panels of the farmer's wall were being removed, and there went his quarry, welcomed into the farmstead. A dozen options swirled through the henchman's mind, but none of them were viable. They had escaped him. As the last panel of the fortified settlement was shoved back in place and fastened tight, the dark elf found himself outside, alone. The shuffle of feet could be heard as the undead, attracted by the ogre's noise, lurched their way towards him. The henchman was quick to shake off the disappointment. He left the scene, but he wasn't going far. The wizard would soon succumb to his injuries, and that would remove a major obstacle. A wooden enclosure wasn't going to prevent him from finding a way into the settlement. The elf and the ogre would be next. Chapter 42. The Dark Lord's henchman received 2 surprises at once, one good, one bad. First, his quarry left the safety of the farm's enclosure, alone, only a few days after they had entered. Second, the wizard was still alive. Both his lower legs had been amputated. He was strapped to the ogre's back in a carrying device, but his survival was unwelcome. The henchman feared no one and nothing in combat, indeed welcomed the clash of blades, but magic introduced too much that was unknown for him to feel secure about the outcome. Still, the dark elf could deploy patience if it was necessary. His master wanted their enemies dead. Far better to take his time and fulfill her orders than to do anything hasty and fail. No, Rogue who burned Irath Simboa didn't do failure. So he followed his quarry north and west, prepared to wait for his opportunity to act. They moved from abandoned farmstead to abandoned village. The dark elf observed them searching for food that the humans hadn't been able to take with them. When they were done, he was forced to scrummage for anything they'd missed or rejected. Drow could go for days without eating if necessary, but even he needed to eat something. If he had to pick up the last of the seeds from the dirt of a granary floor, so be it. Hardship didn't frighten him. After a few days of following at a safe distance, it became clear where Ogrim Dog and his allies were headed. They were going to Merkazere, headquarters of the Bureau of Dungeoneering. What they hoped to achieve there was much harder to work out. This region was now totally infested by the undead. It was almost a certainty that the pathetic defenses of that town couldn't withstand them. When he got his first sight of the town, he got confirmation that his instincts were correct. Lines of the dead were funneling through the various entrances to Merkazere. The gates had been forced open by an undead horde, drawn by the quantity of living flesh inside. The fact that they continued to pour inside suggested that there was still some flesh yet to be eaten. The odd thing was that despite such danger, the Dark Elf observed the ogre charging at one of the entrances into the town, the elf close behind. More through luck than skill, they barged their way into Merkazere and disappeared down one of the streets. Baffling. Nothing would have persuaded the henchman to risk his life as they had just done. It wasn't that he didn't comprehend, on a philosophical level, the decision to live a good life. Like all drow, he was far more on board with doing evil. It was a set of values that just came naturally. But he didn't lack in imagination or recognize that some people had a different moral code. But risking one's life for others? That was something much more difficult to understand. Perhaps, before this mission had begun, the Dark Elf would have left his enemies in Merkazere and assumed they would be killed and eaten by the dead, returned to the Dark Lord and confidently assured her of their demise. Perhaps, but recent experience told him to guard against such optimistic assumptions. His caution was rewarded when he spotted a party leaving the town via its south gate. His quarry had been joined by 4 others. Asata, the barbarian, he knew well from their mission in Kuthenia. Princess Borta, well, she had been their mission. They had kidnapped her and brought her to the Dark Lord. Now she had become the figurehead for the resistance in Kuthenia. Hasseltorf, the halfling, director of the Bureau of Dungeoneering. They had never met, but the henchman knew of him. The 4th figure, a gangly human slung over the ogre's shoulder, he couldn't identify. So 3 had become 7. One could, the Dark Elf acknowledged, see it as a problem. It made his task more difficult. But he was inclined to see the opportunity. Kill this group, and the enemy would be finished in one fell swoop. The Dark Elf followed this enlarged group south. Where they were heading to now, he couldn't guess. It was likely they didn't know themselves. Where was there for these people to go? They spent a night in the open, the henchman finding another tree in which to make his own bed. When he checked on them the next morning, they were all there. But how long could they keep this up? The more he thought about it, the more he thought it likely that the undead would eventually do his job for him. He followed them once they broke camp. More aimless wandering. Then he spied the group standing around the church of a deserted human village. Something had clearly caught their interest. The henchman waited until they had left the village before taking a look himself. A message had been scrawled on the white wall of the building. "Find sanctuary in Babylon. We are safe." Beneath it was an arrow pointing in the direction that the ogre and his colleagues had taken. Babylon? He'd never heard of it, and doubted that his quarry had either. But they were desperate enough to follow the sign. Curious, he did likewise. It wasn't long before he got a sight of this settlement called Babylon. He had to admit that whichever humans had made their home there had done better than he'd expected. A hill had been strengthened with earthworks in a concentric design. At the top, it had been flattened. The henchman could make out a few wooden buildings. Yes, it was basic, but crudely effective for keeping out the dead. He observed as his quarry negotiated for entry into the hill fort. It was denied for some. 3 ascended the rope ladder that had been thrown down by the residents: the halfling, the elf, and the princess. The remainder waited at the base of the hill as the night drew in and the dead began to appear with tiresome inevitability. The ogre dispatched them with an almost absent-minded swing of his mace. At first, the dark elf had trouble understanding what was happening. Then, when he saw them repeatedly tending to the gangly human, he worked it out. He'd been bitten, probably back in Mercazair. Why they hadn't ended his life immediately, it was impossible to say. And why they stood about waiting for him to die and turn into one of the creatures was equally confusing. But that's what they did. Only then did the barbarian use her sword. That was followed by a staggering waste of time and energy as they dug a hole in the ground in which they placed the body before filling it in. Finally, the ogre, barbarian, and wizard were allowed to ascend the rope and enter this place they called Babylon. The dark elf was left to contemplate not only his next move, but the strange behavior he had just witnessed. Chapter 43. The new residents of Babylon began to go about their business, still unaware that a dark elf had been following their every move. He spied on them from his new home up a tree. The hill fort afforded his quarry the best protection they had enjoyed since he first found them in the city of Obolo, but maybe it provided him with an opportunity too. He gave himself time to develop a plan, convinced that the adventurers of Mercazair would not be leaving their refuge in a hurry. Once his decision was made, the henchman got to work. It was a variation on his attack on the barn at the farm. He began collecting any undead who passed his way, lashing them to the lower branches of his tree. This time he covered their faces with cloth, muffling the moans and groans they emitted. Once he had harvested sufficient undead, he had to carry out the hard part of his plan, getting them up to the top of the hill fort. He waited a whole day, then another, for the right moment. Finally, he took his chance. This was risky. Climbing the earthworks of the settlement, trusting that the darkness would shield him from any lookouts at the top of the fort. The henchman scarpered up the steep slopes, agile and powerful, fast-moving but silent. The defenses were good enough to keep out the dead, but not an athlete such as he. The last, most dangerous part was leaping up to the palisade of wooden stakes that surrounded the flat top of the hill. He gripped it with both hands, then pulled himself up and over the palisade. He allowed himself a few moments to catch his breath and wait to see if he had been spotted. It remained quiet. The people of the fort slept. Then he crept to where the rope ladder was stashed, drew it over the edge, and climbed down. Next, he returned to his tree and retrieved his collection of silenced dead. He roped the first 2 to the lower rungs of the ladder. 2 would be heavy enough, even though their decaying bodies were lighter than living ones. Climbed past them and back up to the top of the fort. Then came the physically demanding task of hauling the ladder back up with the 2 creatures attached. Once he had got them up, he released them. At first, of course, their instinct was to eat him, but by once more throwing down the ladder and beginning his descent, they turned instead to the many bodies tucked away inside the wooden homes of the fort. Again and again and again the dark elf did this, not stopping to rest his tired muscles, stretch out his back, or soothe his raw hands. He pushed himself to exhaustion, but each time he did it, another pair of undead warriors shuffled their way slowly towards the sleeping residents of Babylon. Eventually, blood-curdling screams began to issue from the settlement as the Babylonians awoke to find the risen dead had entered their homes, were scratching and biting and chewing them. None had the presence of mind, at first, to come and check the rope ladder. The henchman completed his work. Once he heard the sounds of fighting and of organized resistance to his invasion, he retreated. Plan implemented, he retired to his tree and let his scheme play out. The Babylonians defended themselves from the Dark Elf's surprise nighttime undead attack better than he'd expected them to. A significant number of corpses were buried at the bottom of the hill the next morning, but only one that really mattered to the henchmen. The wizard was finally dead. He crept towards the gathering, where the enemy performed their rites. When it was the wizard's turn to get buried, the three-headed ogre spoke to the assembly.
I feel that we are partly responsible for the death of Sandon,
said the head-called dog. The Dark Elf could see the ogre's fellow adventurers raise an eyebrow or roll their eyes at this statement. How amusing! Somehow they blamed the ogre for the wizard's death. Then, first one, then all three ogre heads began to leak water out of their eyes. They sniffled, as if they had suddenly caught a sickness.
Sandon was a very good friend to us,
said the head called Og, in a strange, husky voice. It then appeared that the ogre had completely lost the power of speech. In the end, the light elf walked over, gave the ogre a gentle pat, and took over the rest of the speech for him. At first, the Dark Elf thought that the ogre might be coming down with the undead sickness, but then he realized that his afflictions were caused by sadness. He was most surprised to see such emotion on the face of a former henchman of the Dark Lord, not least one who had done such terrible things as Ogrim Dog. The henchman reflected on this. He had seen sadness before. Not even once in the harsh realm of Cleath Tenori Kilith Tuan, but many times since leaving his homeland. After killing his victims' family members, or indeed their pets, he had seen humans and other races express sadness. He couldn't recall seeing it after killing their colleagues or allies, though the ogre hadn't called this wizard Sandon an ally. He had called him a friend. The Dark Elf began to speculate what that word might mean. An ally who you would be sad to see die, he supposed. That led him on to ask himself the question, would anyone be sad if he were to die? Would the Dark Lord mourn him as the ogre had mourned the wizard? He didn't think so. She would wish he wasn't dead, because he was her most valuable henchman. But he supposed, in the end, she would just shrug her shoulders and find a replacement. Once the Babylonians had completed their rites and returned to their fort, the Dark Elf found it hard to shake off this new line of thought. The henchman had to admit that he was beginning to change his mind on a number of things. Not least, he had decided that despite his initial pride at being asked to complete his task alone, he did, after all, need some allies. Allies were not easy to find in a post-apocalyptic world such as this. The goblins who dwelled in Strong Club would have to do. Their leader, who went by the frankly ridiculous name of Graviaxrerm, was easily persuaded to intervene in the settlement of Babylon. "You have many more soldiers than they do," the Dark Elf assured him, aware that goblins were a weak and cowardly race at the best of times. Graviaxrem smiled at this. The henchman found the goblin a little bit disturbing, hard to read, altogether too clever for a goblin. "I'm inclined to make Babylon the first conquest of my new empire," the goblin leader said. "Well, do what you wish, as long as those individuals I have specified are killed. Do not underestimate that ogre, either." Graviaxrerm waved away his concerns. I happen to have an ogre of my own. We can deal with Og Grim Dog. A goblin with an ogre? This was most unusual. But these were certainly unusual times. Succeed in this, and my masters will reward you most handsomely. Your empire might spread wider than you can imagine. The goblin beamed at the thought of his shitty little empire. Who really knew what Lilith and Samael intended to do at this part of Galazoo? Indeed, all of Galazoo. The Dark Elf suspected that a post-apocalyptic world such as this might be remembered as the good old days once they were done with it. He turned and left Strong Club, left Graviaxrum to his plans and dreams. This mission had lasted long enough. It was time to return to his masters, time to serve them in some other way. The recorder scratched the final words of the chapter onto his parchment, then rubbed his aching wrist. "So, that was it?" he dared to ask. "You returned to the Dark Lord with the job half done? Did you tell her the truth?" The Dark Elf shrugged with indifference. "I'd had enough of that mission. I left the rest of it to the goblins. But of course I told the Dark Lord the truth. Only a fool would do otherwise." The recorder allowed that answer to sink in for a while before more questions surfaced. "Did Graviaxrum attempt to complete your mission? What did the Dark Lord say when you returned? What did she have you do next?" But the Dark Elf appeared to have gone elsewhere. His eyes had a distant look to them, as if he were reliving some moment from his past. The recorder shuffled his stack of parchment aggressively, but his interviewee didn't notice. Just as he was thinking about standing up and leaving the private room of Ro Kubernid Irathsimboa, indeed as he was thinking that leaving alive should be classed as a victory in itself, the Dro's attention snapped back to him. All questions that can be answered another day. Suffice to say, it wasn't the last time I saw the infamous ogre, or grim dog.
This has been Interview with the Dark Elf, written by Jamie Edmundson, performed by Chuck Wagner. Copyright Jamie Edmundson 2021.